So my speech today, putting this together has been, as you probably found as well, absolute murder. Why? Well, let me tell you the ways. So our esteemed chairman here, Mr. Keir Martland, my goodness, what a great guy he is. He says a few months ago, we're doing this conference on the 30th of March. I think, brilliant. And then he says, what would you like to do? And I go, Brexit, baby. Because I thought that we'd be out by now. Because we heard this, didn't we, 108 times at least from the robot here, Mrs. Theresa May, that we will be leaving on March the 29th, yesterday at 11 p.m. I was actually there last night with a glass of whiskey at 11:01, celebrating kind of Pyrrhic victory of Brexit. So, this is what happened. It was just a dream. She goes to the EU, she sits in a room, and on a whim, she moves it to April the 12th. And then she might move it again later, of course, as well, with a click of her fingers. Why? When she was asked in Parliament, because the EU law trumps British law, she said. This woman does not have a soupçon of irony in her blood. The EU law trumps British law, that's how I was able to get away with it. Amazing. So, what do you think? Should I burn in hell for having believed her? I think maybe I should. And that was after decades of being a Misesian. So where are we now? David's given us a great sort of historical narrative, but I think this is where we are. We're in a carry-on situation. I love Hattie Jakes here as Angela Merkel. That's pretty good. So who the heck knows where we are? So what have we had? We've had a referendum called by a man who didn't want to call it, forced into that by Nigel Farage, and then the referendum was set up by a civil service that didn't want to set it up and didn't prepare for 3 years to do anything at all. And then we had Project Fear rammed down our throats for 3 years as well. And yet somehow, against the inevitable cultural Marxist tide, we actually managed to win, which is unbelievable. 3 years, that's half the length of the Second World War. Think about that. This isn't the Battle of El Alamein, it's not the Battle of the Atlantic, it's not the Battle of Britain. It's ditching a rule book, a big rule book, but that's all it is. Is my zip down? Keep looking at me in a funny way. But we actually managed, unlike Steve McQueen in The Great Escape, we actually did the jump, we actually got over the fence. Well, we thought we'd got over the fence. But little did we think, or maybe we should have thought, that a great mother of parliaments just down the road there would be so bold as to spend those 3 years constantly chipping away at Brexit. We've got a Prime Minister, she appointed Boris Johnson. I know he's only light Brexit, but he was nominally Brexit. David Davis, the Brexit Secretary, and Steve Baker, my hero. I love Steve Baker. Wish we could have got him here today. I love Steve Baker. What a fabulous guy. Appointed. And they worked away. But as Steve Baker said later, that was just a Potemkin structure. She put them in place knowing she was going to ignore everything they did. And we'll maybe get onto a bit of that later on. But what I wanted today to be, I wanted today to be a kind of 4th of July moment. A celebration, an Independence Day, baby. That's what I wanted it to be today. And what if we had an extension, and then there'll be another extension, and then there'll be another extension. Who knows when we're going to get out of this situation. What we see is the EU, even in the last week, we've had a ban on memes, which has been announced with a very dodgy vote, with 13 people voting for it who didn't realise they were voting for it, with only a majority of 5. But the EU's not going to rescind that decision because they got what they wanted. We've seen an introduction of speed limiters on cars. You're not going to be able to buy a car that you can govern the speed of. So what will it mean next week? This is where the EU's going down the road to serfdom. Love Firefly. Serenity, what a great movie. We can actually see in France every weekend what the EU is going to become. I mean, look at this. If they were wearing white, wouldn't they be identical situations there? But, however, been a bit gloomy so far, but I think there is hope. There is hope. Why is there hope? Because, yep, the entire civil service is against us. The BBC, I watched 3 hours of the BBC and Sky News yesterday. Oh my goodness, by the end of it I was going, second referendum, customs union, yeah. The power of that is unbelievable. I had to go and lie down with a wet flannel over my face. Democracy is a god that has failed, yes, in a spectacular fashion, but they can't airbrush away 17.4 million people. This could go on for years, but it's not going away. Even if there's a second referendum with voting us into the customs union, this is not going away. I think as well, maybe some of you in the room don't even know what the fuss is about, but if we do want to create a Hoppian Hopper world with a lot of private law societies all around the world and 1,000 Liechtensteins in Europe, then we do need to keep fighting for, there's only one way to it in my opinion, secession, secession, then secession, and then what next? Say secession. Secession. Secession next. Pay attention, kids. So, let's take a look at Europe in the, this is 15th century, Central Europe. This is what Hopper's talking about. What's so good about this model? Well, with this model we get trade fairs, later on we get the wonderful music of German and Austria, we get Mozart, Beethoven, Wagner, all that music coming out of this. And why was this so good? Because if you were the king, and I didn't like you, all I had to do was get on a horse, spend half a day riding to the next kingdom, and then I'd live with this king just down the River Rhine somewhere. Brilliant! This is why states hate little tiny places, because you can always leave and go somewhere else. Okay, so I called this the good, the bad and the Brexit. So what was good about Brexit? Well, first of all, having the decision in the first place. David Cameron a hero. It's a stretch, but I'll go with you for giving us this. Do you remember this? This will be your decision. Not the MPs, not Jeremy Corbyn, not Adam Bolton on Sky News. This will be your decision. So that was one great thing. What else have we got? Do you remember this? Were you old enough to vote?
No.
Oh, do you remember? Oh, you don't look old enough to vote. You look old enough to vote. Do you remember this? Does it say leave with the customs union? Does it say leave inside the single market? No, it says leave. That's all it says. The government produced this. The civil service produced this. That's all I remember. I don't remember anything else. Or in the words of Steve Baker yesterday, a triple locked infinite backstop. Leave with a triple locked infinite backstop. And yet, these people down the road, these MPs, 400 of them last Wednesday voted to say no deal is off the table. Obviously none of them have ever been in business. Anyone who's been here in business, you know you've got to have a walk-away position. You cannot negotiate unless you're prepared to get up and say, sorry, can't do it, and walk away. If somebody knows that you have to have a deal, they've got you literally over a barrel. Unbelievable. So I'll remember this. Remember this. No deal is better than a bad deal. And then she tried to prove the rule there by creating the worst deal I've ever seen in my entire life, an infinite backstop. So that was good as well. But here's the best thing, look at this. Oh, my laser works, that's good. 17.4 million to leave, look at this. Most of England and Wales, only London, where we have hundreds of thousands of civil servants, tax eaters, and we have the people in the city who live on the benefits of money printing by the Bank of England, mostly, and regulation of banking, which preserves their high incomes. All the rest of England and Wales leave. 9 regions, 3 against. But the MPs, 486 remain MPs. But think about what that majority was, 1.3 million I think that was. Wembley Stadium, has anyone been to Wembley Stadium?
Yes.
Yeah, amazing, isn't it? But big. Now imagine that filled, got 14 of those filled, 90,000 people, and that's just the majority. That's not the other 16.5 million who voted for Remain.
Leave.
Oh, sorry, leave. Yeah, and those other people. So, thank you for that. But the MPs are going to try and get us to forget this. Are you going to forget this?
Oh,
Say no.
no.
Good. No. Right. Now, the MPs may have tried to turn this into an indefinite process. And one of the things they've been saying, of course, is we must take the Remainers into account, 48%. That's fine, that's good. Can you imagine if they'd won? Can you imagine if Remain had won with 52%? Would they have taken the 48% of Leavers into account? No, we'd have just sailed straight on into the EU as if nothing had happened at all. And the 48% of people who voted Leave, forget them, who cares? We won 52% voting Remain if they'd won the other way around. We'd have just gone straight on. So I'm asking, what am I asking for today? I'm asking you to share the faith of Professor Hopper here. Keep the faith. Those 17.4 million people, I'm one of them, are not going away. We must make sure that with whatever spare energy you have from having to make a living and so on, that we keep fighting against this and we make sure the British Parliament fails to get away with this treachery against us. One of the strange things about Brexit is when I voted in that voting booth, I can't tell you which way I voted, by the way, that's illegal, I think, but I'll let you guess later on. Who knew that this was going to become the defining issue, this invisible line on a map? I mean, when we were voting to get out of the European Union, but this invisible line on a map in Ireland has become the defining issue, which is very, very weird. So let's try and do many, many things to try and beat these people. I think one of the main things we should do, if you can, Sean, wherever he's gone, did this very, very successfully about 20 years ago and actually had a conversation with David Cameron when he tried to out him as a pro-European person. We need to identify all of these Remain MPs. A lot of them are going to try and hide and hope we forget who they are before the next election. So we need to identify them, label them, and let every constituency know who they are, so everyone knows who to vote against. So those are the good things, the big majority, having the referendum in the first place. So what's been bad? Well, what's been bad is this woman, and that trick she used with Steve Baker and David Davis, getting them to work away on a proper Brexit. And they almost reached the point, I think they had a verbal agreement with Michael Barnier. It was like a kind of Iceland or Canada Plus option, and they had a verbal agreement to go with that. They brought it back excitedly to Theresa May, and then she told them immediately, stop, don't tell anyone, forget all about it. Now, to my mind, with hindsight, they should have immediately resigned, this is with hindsight, and then revealed that they had this verbal agreement with Michael Barnier, but they didn't. They probably hoped for the best, because at that point then Theresa May revealed in a big kind of magic trick that she'd been working on her own agreement with the Cabinet Office Europe unit on her own Chequers agreement. And then we had the backstop, the infinite backstop, which I remember a friend of mine was in Bodrum Airport last September. And he said to me, and he'll remember who he is. He'll remember who he is, won't he, Sean? Yeah. It doesn't matter how bad the deal is, because as long as we get out, because even if it's 4 years locked under the single market, as long as we have an end date and we get it, it doesn't matter how bad it is. So he actually persuaded me, and then we get back and we find out about this Chequers agreement, and we find out about this backstop. So this line on the map has become this crucial thing. A fantastic device, by the way, one of the ugliest political devices I've ever seen in my entire life, but actually quite a good trick. Now, whichever civil servant cottoned onto this to use this as a way to trap us inside the EU, to beg in 5 years' time to go back in, which I think is what the plan was, I reckon they'll have been given a big pay rise and a promotion for coming up with using this device to trap us inside the EU. But with an end date, we'd have had this kind of view of the world. We'd have seen the light at the end of the tunnel, I think. Because I think what they were trying to do was trap us in the Hotel California, a real Brino deal, a Brexit in name only deal, which is why Steve Baker was my hero, by the way. Did you know he's my hero? Fantastic. Do you know he helped set up the Cobden Centre? What a brilliant guy. Fantastic. One of the only politicians I have any respect for. They were trying to trap us in this Hotel California. You can never leave. Just goes on, and then eventually we beg to get back in again. And then, of course, we have this man here. Who's been working in the background for a long time now, trying to get what he wants. And what do you think he wants? What do you think he's at? Why is he doing this, do you think? What do you reckon? What do you reckon, Sean? Oh yeah, there's money, but do you think EU president has a nice ring to it for Tony Blair? I think that's what he's been working on in the background. Mr. EU president. So what are we going to have next, do you think? Well, was it 8 different possibilities? 6. Who knows what's going to happen? Is Theresa May going to get tossed out of office? I hope so. Are we going to have another general election? Probably, possibly. Oh, they don't want it. Okay, so a second referendum because we didn't get the first one right. Remember when we used to laugh at places like Portugal and Ireland who kept getting these second referendums? We used to laugh at them and say, what silly countries, what silly people to accept this. And yet they're trying slowly to kind of sneak us into that one. Now, we've got to hold the faith, I think. We've got to hold the faith. Unlike this man, a former hero of mine, but no longer a hero, who caved in here. He caved. He said, oh, I'll only do this if the DUP vote for it. They said we're not voting for it, but he did it anyway. Shredded his credibility, which is very, very, very unfortunate for most of us. But if we hold our faith, I think unlike this man, then I think we'll still get a Brexit in the end. I think it might be a long, long way away. Theresa May, she makes this man, I think, look like Apollo, the god of judgment. Unbelievable Prime Minister. But I do hope these two can get back together in the next few months. I hope you notice Steve Baker's on the light side of the photograph. Jacob Rees-Mogg's on the dark side. There's a lot of subtlety going on here. Try and be aware of that subtlety. And this is Steve Baker. What a fantastic guy. Now, let's get a little technical. So why do we need Brexit? Well, we need Brexit because the state loves bigger states. The bigger the state, the more power the state has. And I think if you take a country and then you halve it, the power of the two remaining governments is always going to be less than the power of the single government that used to rule that state. Always. If you take it down ad infinitum, down to the lowest level, if we go right down to the individual, we also see down to the individual. There is no state. The state has absolutely no power. But for about 5,000 years, states have been coalescing, like kind of viruses, sort of slowly growing. This was one of the first major kings. This is King Narmer of Egypt. He came out of Upper Egypt, went down the Nile, and bludgeoned his way into controlling Lower Egypt to create a greater state, and then his power grew immensely. If we go into an EU, and then the EU links up with a Pan-African Union, and then a Pan-Asian Union, and eventually we get to kind of a world government, then we will be entirely powerless as individuals. And you might say, Rick, yeah, but Mises' calculation argument says that a world government will have no information, but there'll be economic chaos. You would say that, wouldn't you? Yeah, you'd say that. You'd come straight off the bat. But it still took 70 years for the Soviet Union to collapse without any economic information, and they failed eventually because of Mises' argument.
They had the West, the ruble.
Yeah, but the West backing them.
Yeah.
Can we hold this on for later? No heckling, please. No bottles.
Coffee break.
So a world state could last an awful long time. So they wouldn't even need to build a gulag, because the whole world would be a gulag. Where do you go? Remember we had our man on a horse goes to the next kingdom? Can't go anywhere when the whole world is ruled by a state. So we must secede, we must fight the EU, we must try to fight this process. So again, this is Murray Rothbard. Once one concedes that a single world government is unnecessary, then where does one logically stop at the permissibility of separate states? So I'm kind of a Rothbardian as well as a Misesian and a Hoppian. He was all for secession, and of course my other hero, Hans Hermann Hoppe. It's advisable to concentrate one's efforts on decentralisation, nullification and peaceful separation, segregation and secession. And so a process of secession, which is Brexit is part of, can turn this inevitable Marxist socialist tide of history. We can turn it round, just as the election of Trump did in the US maybe, just as the American secession did in 1776, which created an enormous pillar of freedom when the Americans escaped from the great British Empire state. Now I'm just coming towards the end now, and with apologies to William Shakespeare. I'm going to have to take my jacket off for this. You might see why in a second. And unfortunately, I do need to put my glasses on. I was going to try and memorise this, but I wasn't able to. I was trying last night. And here we go. Again, this is with apologies to William Shakespeare. To go or not to go without a deal, that was never the question. Whether 'tis ignoble in the minds of some for the slings and arrows of outrageous prime ministers, or to take arms against the sea of Westminster poltroons, and by opposing them, to deselect them, to vote them out, no more, and by a sleep to say to end their careers. The heartache and the thousand natural shocks of Brexit, that flushes air to it is a consummation, I tell you. Devoutly to be wished, to die, to vote on second referendums, perchance to dream of freedom. But there's the rub. For in that sleep of the backstop, what dreams may come when this utter Lady Macbeth, Theresa May, has shuffled off this mortal coil, yes please, must give us pause. There's no respect for her at all. That makes calamity of so disastrous a premiership. For she should bear the whips and scorns of time. The EU oppression is wrong here. It's wrong. Quickly, with a bare political agreement, who would Farage bear to grunt and sweat under a vassal state? That dread of something after political death, an undiscovered Canada option, from whose bourne she returns as EU Commissioner with a £500,000 a year salary, puzzles my will, and rather makes us bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of, such as that disgusting toad, Michael Gove. Thus conscience makes cowards out of most MPs, including Jacob Rees-Mogg, unfortunately, but excluding the noble Steve Baker. Did I tell you I like him? That's fantastic. And thus the native few of indicative resolutions is sickly low with the pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pith and moment, with this regard their currents turn awry, and lose the name of action, go soft, the ERG. The gruesome Theresa Crone in thy horizons, be all her sins always remembered. I just want to finish off with some other words of Winston Churchill. I had hoped today would be Brexit Day, yes, and that we'd be out, dear Keir, of the European Union. This may not be the end, but I hope it is the beginning of the end. So let's get out of the EU. I'll throw that in there. This sweet spectred isle. We defeated the Armada. We defeated Napoleon with the help of a lot of Germans, including von Blücher, of course. We defeated the Germans again. I should say Hitler, not the Germans. Why can't we beat the EU? Why can't we ditch a rule book, a very big rule book? If we can defeat all these things, why can't we defeat a big rule book? And even then, I think we'll save the rest of Europe. Again, if we can leave, hopefully we can bring on the collapse eventually of the EU under a blizzard of their own euro paper money. To do this, though, we've got to keep fighting. It is going to cost us blood, toil, tears and sweat. And we do now, unfortunately, seem to have a long way to go. But we should continue fighting them, and we should never surrender. I commend this motion to the House. Thank you.